ready to jump into a new series. If you have your Bibles, we're going to be in the book of Hebrews. And wow, one is excited for Hebrews. That's fantastic. So let's just get a couple things out of the way. I will not be making the joke except for today. You've all seen the coffee pot. You all know it. Hebrews. Let's get that out of the way. We're not going to say it anymore. Okay, we're done. All right. Everybody's brought it up. Like, have you seen? Yes, I've seen. I have not purchased the shirt. It is fine. It is funny. There. Okay, so the other thing is that I need to acknowledge is that for the ladies in the room, how many ladies in the room were part of my wife's study when she went through the book of Hebrews? Okay, that is, okay, calm down. It will not match up to that. So let's just put that out there as well, all right? So we got both those out there. We're feeling good about it, all right? So we're going to just dive right in. It's going to be a good time as we walk through the book of Hebrews together. We're going to be taking it in some larger chunks, and you'll see why here in just a little bit. It was interesting as I was thinking about this morning. I was thinking about all of the messages that we receive on a regular basis. So I don't know if you know or not, but it's college football season. I don't know if you know or not, but it's fantasy football season. And how many are fantasy football people in the room? A couple. All right. All right. So how many? Let me ask this a better question. How many were the first-time fantasy football people in the room? Okay, that's what I thought. All right, so I was in the middle of a soccer game, which has nothing to do with football, and all of a sudden, like, I'm getting these, like, notifications that this draft is happening that I'm part of, and I'm like, I'm at a soccer game, I'm going to go to auto draft, and I thought that was plenty, and then all of a sudden, like, have you ever been in a situation where somebody group texts, and it's on its, like, 50th message on your phone, and you're like, oh my gosh. And so you're trying to turn it off. And then at the same time, like, you have somebody next to you, let's say your spouse, who's reading these, and she's like, this is hilarious. You need to read these. And I'm like, I don't have time to dive into all of this. And there's just message after message after message, and it's just this distraction. Well, I thought that was one. And then, sure enough, yesterday, we went to the boys' soccer game. If you catch a theme here, I'm kind of into soccer this year. And so as we went into the boys' game, like, all of a sudden I get these messages from both of my daughters who had two different campuses, very different questions coming in and very different conversations. And I'm trying to watch the game and still see, the messages on the phone. And it's just a distraction because you're trying to catch up on everything, and there's a lot of messages coming through. So let me just kind of start with this. When we think of our text messages and things and distractions we have coming in, I thought it'd be good just to kind of acknowledge it this morning. How many of you have more than like 20 unread messages on your phone currently? Oh my gosh, what is wrong with you people? Okay, so how many of you have like more than 30? What? How many of you have more than 40? Oh my gosh. Do you have friends? Do they respond back to you? Okay, so that's a lot. All right, so literally you have more than 40, Steve? Oh my gosh. Nobody text Steve because he's not going to respond to you at all. They're just going to sit in his box. What? 201? Oh my gosh. That's a problem. Have I got a sermon for you? All right, so that's a lot of messages, which has a lot of distractions, which has already caused a lot of distractions within the room. So let me kind of bring it back. That did not go the way I'd planned. All right, so as we have all these messages and all these things coming in, they can be these huge distractions to our life. And here's the thing that you're going to see in the book of Hebrews. There's a lot of messages that come into the book of Hebrews, and a lot of odd messages that come into the book of Hebrews, and a lot of ones you're kind of like, where is he going with this? Because there's some hard things that you're going to read in the book of Hebrews when it comes to these messages he's giving us. But I'm telling you, I think if you kind of look at the trees above the forest, like if you look at the forest above the trees kind of idea, and you're just kind of seeing the overall picture of Hebrews, I really think you're going to see this is a really great letter that is written to say, have you elevated the view of Jesus above everything else in your life? And secondly, there's going to be a challenge almost every chapter of, do you believe that's true? Like, do you believe that he's better than these things? We just sang it. It's on banners now. Like, do you really fully believe that Jesus is better? And that's where we're going to head throughout this book. And so I want to just kind of start with some intro into the book of Hebrews and then just kind of share where we're going. So if you have your Bibles, we'll be in Hebrews chapter 1, all the way through into chapter 2 as well. But I want to give you a couple things just head knowledge-wise, before we jump into the book, to kind of give you an awareness of where we're heading with it, okay? So first off, within this book, you kind of have to know an overview of the Old Testament, because if you look at this letter, you're going to hear a lot of things in this letter that are really based off of the Old Testament. You're going to see that a lot. And so basically, as you think of the Old Testament, what do you mean Old Testament? What I mean by that is not just like creation, fall, all that kind of stuff. What I mean by that is Jesus, or God decided in his sovereignty to take a man named Abraham and call him by name and to set up a nation called Israel. And then he gave this nation called Israel a law through this guy named Moses, and gave these 10 commandments to a nation of Israel, and then gave them a people in Exodus, and then out of that created a land for them through the book of Joshua, so that by the end of the book of Joshua, the Israelite nation exists. It has people, it has laws, it has land. It is an official nation coming out of the book of Joshua. And then if you come out of the book of Joshua, you read that they don't really have much of a leadership process, because Moses didn't really transfer as much to Joshua as maybe he had thought. And then Joshua definitely didn't transfer as much as he knew about God to the people behind him. And then you get the book of Judges, and Judges is this whole thing of like, hey, people just went crazy and did whatever it is that they wanted to do. And then eventually through Judges, you have some people ruling Israel, but then that didn't work. So then they're like, we want a king. They get a king. That didn't really work out for the first round. They get a second king by the name of king named David. He has a king by the name of, or he has a son by the name of Solomon. And basically, you just watch Israel's history from the Old Testament unwrap in front of you. And what you see in the book of Hebrews is he's going to rely a lot on our knowledge of the Old Testament to kind of make sense of what Jesus is in the present. And so for a lot of people, they've had a very negative view of the Old Testament. I don't know about you, but I've talked to a lot of people, and they're like, God seems like a very different person in the Old Testament than he does in the New Testament. He seems like he's very angry and ticked off in the Old Testament and not in the New Testament. Is that true? And I'm going to say that's really not true at all. I think what he's doing is developing a nation, and I think there's some things we need to learn about that. But what I think you're going to see is there's a very common thing between Old Testament and New Testament, and that is that he was always trying to restore a relationship with his people, and he knew that a Messiah was coming. And so all of that to say, Abraham, Israel, Moses, Mount Sinai, desert wandering nation, that's kind of our background to the letter. This letter then was, okay, so who's it written to? Just give you some context here. It was written to the Jewish people living before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Jewish people who embraced the Greek culture. The Hellenistic Jews we talked about last week. I'm not going to go into all of that. But basically, there was a group of people that adopted the culture of the time. You had those that were like, we're not going to embrace the culture of the time. And so there's some discrepancy between those two parties in this letter that he's writing, and those who had then been converted to Judaism through the Greek culture. But all of that to say, this word Hebrews, it's all of the Hebrew people, whether it's I converted, whether it's I'm a Jew by blood, but I really like the Greek culture and I'm adapting, or whether it's the I'm of Jewish blood and nothing will ever come close to it, so don't even bother to try to convince me that there's anything better. That's the people he's writing to, and there's a lot of differences within those group of people. But here's the clear message in this book, if you get nothing else. The clear message is this: Jesus is superior to the things that we hold dear. Jesus is better, superior to all things. And the book of Hebrews is all about that. Two main goals, which we heard about already, and that is our book is going to do two things. One, it's going to elevate your view of Christ, of who is he really, and secondly, it's going to challenge us to live like we actually believe it. There's going to be some hard challenges in this book. Ones you're kind of be like, I'm uncomfortable with that. And we're going to be like, yep, exactly. Because Jesus is saying, I will have no other one beside me. There will be no other rulers in front of me. It will just be me. And every other thing that comes in between competition and me and my kingdom is going to be obliterated. And so Jesus is going to be seen as elevated, and everything else around it is to challenge whether we live like it is true or that we actually believe it. Now, as you look at the book of Hebrews, okay, we're going to look at chunks. So there are four main obstacles that the book of Hebrews addresses to the challenges to Jesus and his superiority. Does that make sense? So the goal is Jesus is better than all these things. And in the book of Hebrews, he's going to give us kind of some big chunks, some four big obstacles that are in the way of seeing Jesus clearly. And so the first one he gives us is in chapters 1 and 2, and that's angels and Torah. And those are going to be saying is those are better than Jesus. The second one is Moses and the promised land. In chapters 3 and 4, you're going to see that Moses is superior to Jesus, and that becomes an obstacle to people. Wait, what do you do with Moses? What do you do with all the things we had promised? You're going to see priests as being elevated above Jesus in very specific ways. Melchizedek, which we're going to see later on. And then you're going to see sacrifices and covenants as being better than Jesus. Now, if you look at this list, probably not a Western American list of things that are obstacles to Jesus, correct? Angels, Torah, Moses, priests. But to the Hebrew people, these were the things that were in the way of seeing Jesus as better. They would say, Jesus is good, but angels are up there. Jesus is good, but Moses is better. Whatever it is, these are the obstacles we're going to see play out throughout the book of Hebrews. So let's just start with the first one this morning. We're going to be in angels and Torah this morning. We're going to Hebrews chapter 1 and 2, and we're going to look at the first obstacle, which is angels and the Torah being an obstacle to what this is all about. So let me just kind of start here. Let's read Hebrews chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom he also created the world. He is, this is crazy. If you get anything else out of Hebrews, get this one. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. He says he is the radiance and he is the imprint. So he is the sunbeams that we receive from the sun, and he is the wax ring symbol imprint upon a document. What they would understand this as is he was the radiance of the sun. So when you see the sun, you don't actually see the sun. I think we all know that from science class, but if you haven't, you're welcome. You actually don't see the sun. You see the rays of the sun, because if you were to see the sun, you'd have to be a lot closer. And so light travels over time and space. We're seeing the effects of time and space as it gets delivered to the earth, so we see the rays of the sun. We see the radiance of it. Jesus is the radiance of God, and it says he is the imprint. So back then they would have these rings that were worn by the kings and by Caesars, and they would dip it in wax, and they'd put it upon a document. They say, this is my seal, this is approved by me. And that imprint would be the imprint of the king. And so they say that Jesus is the radiance of the sun. He is the imprint of God himself. So basically, here's what he's saying. If you see Jesus, you see God. And he says, because that is true, he says he is superior to angels. So let's just start there. Angels, what are they? Okay. What do they look like? So I'm just giving you a couple things that they are not. They are not this. Okay. They are not him. He at least doesn't have wings, so that's good. But apparently he's going to get them once he hears the bell, which that's not true either. So that's not an angel. This is not an angel. How many of you 80s fans? Anybody? Yeah. Nobody. All the 80s, all the kids who grew up in the night, like you weren't even born then. You're like, I don't even understand that joke. It's worth it. All right. This is not an angel either. This not close, and this clearly is not an angel. Although there was a movie made about. Oh, come on! You got to pull the last picture up. There it is. That's not an angel either, okay? So he may be filming a new movie in which he's wearing wings, but Keanu is not, even in the movie Constantine. It's a whole other story, okay? So he is not an angel by no stretch of the imagination. Is this what angels look like? Angels, as opposed to what many of you think, angels actually don't have wings. The cherubim are the ones that have the wings. So the angels actually are more in human forms. Let's just talk about what the angels actually are. Angels, if you were to translate it, is actually the word messenger. They were messengers by God to give messages from God to human beings here on earth. They are messengers. Angels are protectors. We see that throughout Scripture, that there are hosts of armies of angels that protected God's people. They live in a supernatural realm that we do not see. Some are given names such as Gabriel and Michael, but they always point back to God. They are seen throughout the Old Testament And here's the thing about the Hebrew people as we read the book of Hebrews. They had a fascination with angels. They were like, if we could just see, touch, experience an angel, life would be awesome. And so they were just all about this idea of angels being superior, better, if we could just get a message from them. And this is different, again, from cherubim, which you see in, we're not going to go into this deeply, but in Genesis 3, the one guarding the tree in Genesis, that's not an angel, that's actually cherubim, and there's a reason for that. If you go from Genesis to Revelation, you can see that whole thing. This is not a theology on angels, so I will stop there. However, angels were seen as superior and better and greater by the Hebrew people, and they had a fascination with these messengers and protectors. Angels in the Old Testament, I think the first one I can find is actually Genesis 18, and it's speaking of angels as far as the name of angels, the broad category of angels. Some would say that the first angel is actually in Genesis 16. Genesis 16, verse 7, the angel of the Lord found her, which is Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. I don't know that that's fully the case because I believe that that verse is looking more towards the Christ figure in that one. It's using the angel of the Lord. But regardless, you can see angels throughout the Old Testament. Genesis 19, Genesis 18, Genesis 22, Genesis 32, Exodus 3, the angel of the Lord appears. This could be Christ again in form in Exodus chapter 3 of Moses and the burning bush. Exodus 14, he said he's the pillar of fire. Numbers 22, Balaam and a donkey. Daniel in the lion's den. Judges 6, 1 Kings 19, Mary, Peter. There are angels all over your Bible. And so to say that they don't exist is not true, but to elevate them superior to what Christ is not what we're looking for either. And so a couple other things about them. Angels remind us that there is an unseen world and that it is real. They remind us that there are spiritual beings that are out there, that they are real and they are living today. Angels directly glorify God and always point back to Him. They do not seek their own name or their own recognition. We can see this in Judges chapter 13. There's a guy in Judges by the name of Samson. Samson has a mom and dad. Mom and dad have an angel visit them, and this angel comes to them and has some words to say. In Judges 13, 17 to 18, and Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, "What is your name, so that when your words come true, we may honor you?" And the angel of the Lord said to him, "Why do you ask me my name? Seeing it is wonderful." In other words, this isn't about names and figures. This is about glory that goes back to God Himself. They had a respect that God came close to these messengers and thought that they would, and those who encountered these messengers, these angels, if you encountered one, you thought you would die, right? You see that often. In Judges 13, it continues in 21 and 22. The angel of the Lord appeared no more to Manoah and to his wife. Then Manoah knew that he was the angel of the Lord, and Manoah said to his wife, "We shall surely die, for we have seen God." Angels always in Scripture always come with power and authority, and it's almost like they should come with like a little like name badge of like, "Hi, I'm an angel, don't freak out." Like it's just kind of like that same, like everybody they come to, it's like, "Hey, I'm an angel, calm down, chill out. We're going to be okay here." Because every time they encountered one, they freaked out. They thought they were going to die because of the power and magnitude that came with them. So these are not small baby cherubims, winged, diapered figures floating on harps. That's not what we're going for here. Angels were actually human forms, and they were messengers, protectors of God. And the message we see in chapters 1 and 2, all that to say, you're like, that was a lot to get to this. It is. All that to say, chapters 1 and 2 are telling us that Jesus is far better, I would say the word superior, to angels. We just read it in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 4, having become much more superior to angels as the name he was inherited is more excellent than theirs. Now, take a break, take a breathing. We got angels, Christ is superior, and now we got to go back into the form of Hebrews, okay? We said Hebrews was all about the Old Testament, right? If you look at the entire book of Hebrews, I think there's around 30 plus Old Testament references in the book of Hebrews. So if you think there's a lot of references, you're right, because he's always pointing back. And in chapters 1 and 2, we see at least 8 Old Testament quotations in chapter 1 and in chapter 2 alone. And so we don't have time to dive into these, but here's my challenge for you. If you want to dive deeper into the book of Hebrews, I would challenge you that every time you see an Old Testament quotation, look it up, go back, see its context, because when you see it in its context and why he chose to use that Old Testament reference, it's going to shine like 5 other lights on the scripture that you didn't see originally. You're going to be like, oh my goodness, I didn't see that. Oh my goodness, that's crazy. How did he know? So that's all of the Old Testament references are going to be about 30 some plus. For our sake this morning, I just want to look at these 8 that he gives us. You could say 9 Old Testament references he gives us in chapters 1 and 2. So stick with me. This is not going to be a long thing. We're going to get into more of the practical here in a second. But in 1 and 2, we see at least 8 references. You could say 9 because in the beginning he goes to 2 Samuel, but for our sake, let's just stick with the Psalms and Isaiah that he gives us. So let's just kind of go through these. So if you look at verses 5 all the way to 14, right? That's a lot of quotes. That's a lot of quotations and a lot of words that he uses in the Psalms. I'm just going to give you the brief overview. You can do more on your own. But Psalm number 2 is the first reference he gives us. And in Psalm 2, the reign of the Lord's anointed is the theme. If you look at Psalm 2, it is the reigning or the kingship of God's anointed. So in other words, he says, hey, Jesus is superior to angels. Here's 8 reasons why he's better than angels. Number 1, he is the reigning king of the Lord's anointed. That's clearly seen in Psalm 2, which the Hebrew people would have seen that and said, I get it, that makes sense. Second one, Jesus is better than angels because he is the greatness of the Creator in Psalm 104. He was there at the beginning. He was there speaking things into existence. Jesus is better because of the greatness of the Creator. He goes on, Psalm 45, he is the king who rules on his throne. That goes all the way back into David's words in Psalm 45. Psalm 102, he hears the prayers of the afflicted. That's a crazy psalm. It's a powerful psalm. If you've ever gone through suffering, I would encourage you to spend time in Psalm 102 because Jesus hears the prayers of the afflicted, and he says Jesus is superior to angels in the fact that they don't do that as well. They just kind of are messengers. They don't actually understand, you're going to see that in a second, the prayers of the afflicted. Psalm 110, Jesus is at the right hand. As I read that, I thought, this is crazy little caveat. Do you remember 2 disciples and the request of Jesus? James and John come to Jesus at one point, like, hey, we want just something small from you. And our mom agrees that we're the best for this position. Could we just sit at your right and left hand? And I laugh at that request because as you read this, you're like, the right seat's already taken. The right hand of God is already taken, and it's Jesus. Can you imagine how embarrassed they must have been when they got to heaven? They were like, oh my word, we were trying to take Jesus' seat. Like, that's crazy. But they didn't understand. Jesus is already seated at the right hand, Psalm 110. Psalm 8, his name is known in all the earth. Psalm 22, it's the quote from the cross, why have you forsaken me, is in Hebrews chapter 1. That's in there, and in there for a reason. Psalm 22, the quote from the cross, and then lastly, Isaiah 8. Wait, even when you don't see him, wait. Wait, even when you don't experience him, wait. Now, that's a lot of context, right? I love that the author of Hebrews gives us all of these and then explains why he gives us all of these in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 1. Here is why we get this. Ready? This is awesome. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. Jesus is better. And sometimes we can live as if it's not true, and we drift to all these other things. And he's like, I've just given you powerful examples through the Psalms of why he's better. And the reason I gave you those is so that we don't drift away. And here's our main point this morning. You're going to see it in chapter 2, and that is this. Jesus is a superior message of salvation and suffering. Jesus is a superior message of salvation and of suffering. If you looked at those 8 references, the things they all have in common, he is ruling, he is reigning, he is king, and he understands suffering on a level that we all experience on a regular basis. Whether it's rejection of a friend, a loss of a loved one, a pain of a sin done to us, He understands every part of it. And Jesus is superior than angels because he has a message that he gives to the angels that the angels can't come up with on their own. And that is, I am salvation. And Jesus is better than angels in the suffering category because angels aren't understanding of our suffering. They are created beings to be messengers from God and not understand the suffering that which we endure. The message of salvation and the message of suffering are two things that angels cannot get a grasp of. Hebrews chapter 2, verses 2 to 8. Let's just continue reading. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard. While God also bore witness by signs and wonders and various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. Because this was all given, and it was given outside of just angels. It was given to us by Jesus Christ himself. He's the better messenger. He's the better salvation. He's the better suffering. If angels could only give messages, they're like Jesus' message delivery was far better than any angel you'd ever want to come up against. And he continues then in verse 5, for it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. It has been testified somewhere, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. There's another one of our psalm quotes, right? Now, in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him, but we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Don't miss that. But we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and with honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. He is superior, but yet he came underneath. He is greater than, but he came humbly to serve and to know this idea of suffering. He is superior message of salvation and suffering. And number two, Jesus is superior because he knows what it means to suffer, and he knows what it means to be tempted. So if the first part of chapter 2 reminds us that he is better because he is king and ruling, and he comes to this earth and knows what it means to suffer. You ever have that moment where you're like, God, you don't understand. God, you don't get it. You don't understand how hard this is. Why would you do this? I go to the book of Hebrews and remind myself that he knows, he experiences, he understands those sufferings that which we go through. All those things that we feel like he doesn't understand, that's just us. We're alone in it. It's not true. He's understanding, and because he's come in the human form, he is able to suffer and know this idea well. So much so that not only is he superior message, we see here he is superior because he knows what it means to suffer and be tempted. Hebrews chapter 2, let's look at verses 14 to 18. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. For surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. That's you and I. The Israelite people were the first of that, right? The Hebrew people, that was their guy. That was the founder. He helps the offspring of Abraham. The Jewish people would have said yes. But in that mix, there would also be those who had converted over to see that Jesus is better than Abraham, and now we get Jesus in this helping of his offspring. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect. Highlight and circle the word brothers. Oh my goodness, that Jesus Christ came in human form means he is our earthly somehow brother. That's crazy. How does that work? He took on human flesh so that we could call him brother, that he would understand what it means to have lack of sleep. He would understand what it means to be sick. He would understand what it means to have pimples in middle school. He would understand what it means to be really awkward around girls. Like he would have known all of those things, right? He would have known all those experiences and all those sufferings because he took on human form. I love that. He is our brothers in every respect so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the servants of God to make propitiation for the sins of his people. In other words, to make a way to get rid of the sin in our life. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. In other words, he knows what it means in the great theology of the Italian job to feel fine, right? Freaked out, insecure, neurotic, emotional kind of fine, right? We all have those moments, right? He understands all of them. He understands the suffering of being freaked out in the middle of circumstance. He knows what it means to feel insecure in the middle of a room when everybody else feels like they have it together and you don't. He knows what it means to feel emotional when you feel like I've got no control over what I'm feeling and experiencing right now. I just don't like it. He knows what it means to walk through funerals. He knows what it means to go through divorce. He knows exactly what it feels like to be walking through a betrayal of a friend. He knows all of those things. He knows what it feels like to be tired, to be angry, and to be tempted. And don't miss this. So that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. Isn't that crazy? So that he might become faithful and merciful high priest. What does that mean? That means he's merciful when it comes to your temptations. That means he understands that thing you keep saying yes to, that you want to say no to, all the stinking time. He knows that feeling. That thing that you always want to do that's opposed to God's will, he felt he was tempted like we are, yet without sin, right? So he knows that pressure. He knows that draw. Thankfully, he is God himself, and he understands that God is superior to all of that, but he knows it full well. He is merciful then when it comes to temptation. Yes, I get it, but my blood is enough to cover it. So stop doing it. Stop trying to go on your own and feel like you get to handle every temptation on your own. Know that I am here as a merciful priest. A priest who makes what? Forgiveness of sins, right? That's why he uses the term. And then he says, I am faithful in suffering. I love this. He's not only merciful in your temptation, he is faithful in every single suffering. There is not one single thing that you have had to suffer that he has not been aware of, that he's not been just, I didn't know you had that going on in your life. Every single suffering you have gone through, he has known, he has acknowledged, he has been part of, he understands. And often it's hard because we're like, well, then why didn't he fix it? Right? If he knew and he understands, why didn't he fix it? And the answer to that I don't fully know. I don't know your full story, but here's what I do know. Every single suffering, Hebrews tells us he's experienced so that he would be one that we turn to in the midst of suffering instead of running from. That we would say, yeah, I know you know me. I know you know what's happening. And I know this isn't fun or pleasant, but I'm going to come and run to you anyway because you've promised that you are a faithful and merciful high priest. I love this. He knows the world he came into, people. He knows it's broken. He knows it's jacked up. He knows what the power of sin can do. That's why I think you see Jesus every time he sees people who are lost and running away from it. It's why it breaks his heart to see what this world has done to people. You know those people that you run into and they just have a really hard life? And they wonder where God is. And they say things like, I think God's just picking on me right now. I think God just... And you look at their life and you're like, well, a lot of those choices were you, man. A lot of you could be that way of like, well, that's your choices. You did that to yourself. I think Christ would have a great balance of saying, yes, you've made those choices. Yes, those choices have had consequences. But can I just tell you, man, you ain't that far from what I am here to help you with. You aren't so far removed from me that I can't reach you. That suffering that you've gone through, I see all of those choices, I see all those things you've done, and I still love you anyway. I still want to bring you closer to me because that's the high priest we have. He knows the world and its power that it has. He knows the reality of these things around us. And Jesus is better for your heart and your soul as we live in this broken and fallen world. Why is he better? He made it, he owns it, and he knows it full well. So everything you experience in your life, present, past, future, he's made this world, he owns this world, and he knows it, right? Here's one thing he knows about me, and I think he knows about you. I have a tendency to draw close to the most poisonous things in my life and snuggle up to them and love it, right? It's an analogy somebody said of this idea of like it's a poisonous tree that we just kind of wrap ourselves around it. And we love our sins so much. We love isolation so much. We love being just independent on our own and not having to worry with other people. And just, I love to kind of get away from God. And it's this image of this poisonous tree that the vines just keep wrapping itself around and around and around. And what Jesus says is he looks at us and he's like, I know that's where your heart goes. I know that's what you like to do, but I am good enough and love you enough that I'm going to start lobbing some of that off and cutting some of those branches off so you can remove yourself from that tree that's going to kill you in the end and bring you back to life. And I think that's what suffering often is for us. I think it's God removing us from the things that he knows is not going to be helpful for us. It's the poisonous tree that we wrap ourselves around. He says, I'm going to just kind of pull you off that. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be pleasant, but I need you to know this is for your good. He knows our consistent desire to attach ourselves to these things. This is true of the world that he came into and lived among. Romans chapter 8, verse 20 and 21. For creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself would be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. The poisonous tree analogy right here. That creation, we just draw ourselves closer to it. We're subjected to it in hopes that, and he says, I came so that you would be free from the bondage of corruption and obtain freedom in the glory of God. You see, Jesus knows that feeling you get on a Monday morning. You ever have that feeling on a Monday morning where it's just like the futility sets in? You ever have that Groundhog's Day moment where you wake up on a Monday, you're like, I've been here before. I thought I'd be further along than this, right? You look at your week and you're like, oh man, this is just like on repeat of last week. Like, I know what I need to do on a Monday. I know what Wednesday is going to bring. I know what Thursday is going to look like. Isn't there something different and better? And typically, sometimes we don't always see this here. Typically, this comes in January and February for us in Ohio, right? You wake up and you're just like, nope, I'm good. And you hit the snooze like 6 times because you're like, nope, 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 nope. I know exactly what today's bringing. That futility, that again kind of feeling. You ever had that again kind of feeling? Man, I messed up again? Man, work is going to be the same work that it's always been. That job's always going to be the job that I didn't really like in the first place. That futility is part of a broken world, and he understands it well. He knows the reality of futility. That non-flourishing feeling, the daily grind feeling, the spinning of your wheels, living always like you're in first gear and you can't get out of it, and it's just kind of RPMs are just kind of like, and he's like, shift. You're like, I don't even know how to shift. And just feels pressure, right? He knows the reality of futility. Not only that, he's asking us to choose to deepen your belief in Jesus when you encounter that futility. In other words, he's saying all that futility that you experience on a Monday is there for a purpose. And it's just not just to remind you how bad things are. It's to point you back to Jesus and saying, of course this world isn't the solution. Of course, your job isn't the solution. Of course, your spouse isn't the solution. Of course, your kids or your dog that wakes you up when you shouldn't, right? Like, of course, they aren't your solution. Of course, they're futile. Of course, it feels like you're spinning your wheels because that's this world. He says the reason that's there is to continue to point you back to Him. One of my favorite quotes, Dane Ortland says this: if you want to be a solid, weighty, steady, not overweight, weighty, like solid, radiant old man or woman someday, let the pain in your life force you to believe your own theology. Can I tell you, I have met some really cool people in their late 70s, 80s, and they've been through some stuff, like a lot of stuff. And I look at the pain they've been through, and I look at them and I'm like, oh my goodness, how are you standing right now? And they look back, and I would say they would say the same thing. I was forced to believe my own theology every step of the way. I was forced to believe that Jesus understands my suffering. I was forced to believe that what I say is in Scripture is actually things I believe, right? He says, if you want a solid, weighty, radiant old man or woman someday, let the pain in your life force you to believe your own theology. He continues, let it propel you into deeper fellowship with Christ than ever before. This is key. Don't let your heart dry up. He is in your pain. He's refining you. He's uncoiling you from that poisonous tree that you love so much. That's what He's doing. And He's doing so with a heart and compassion that He knows suffering, and He knows what it means to be tempted. And so as you hear this, I want to give us an opportunity to actually be honest with Him this morning. We don't do this often enough. Jesus is superior than angels of message, and His message is that of salvation, and He knows your suffering, and He knows your temptations. Now comes the challenge He gives us in Hebrews, and that is, do you actually live like that's true? Do you actually believe it? Or is it just something you read here? Because in chapter 2, in verse 14, he says, since the children therefore share in the flesh, He Himself likewise partook of the same thing. All the way down to the end in verse 18. For because He Himself has suffered when tempted, He's able to help those who are tempted. You see, I think this whole thing of chapter 1 and 2 is setting us up to say, Jesus is better. Believe it. Live like it's actually true. And so maybe you're here this morning and your heart is that of suffering, and you're like, you know what? My story's been like rough. Every step, there just seems like there's some obstacle in the way. And so maybe your theology has kind of gotten a little messed up along the way because now, because of all that pain and all those things you've been through, you assume that every good thing you have is eventually going to be taken away from you. Because that's what Jesus does. He takes everything I love and just breaks it apart. That's not what we see here. We see a God who understands your suffering and still says there is hope to be found. Romans chapter 12, verse 15. To those who are in this room and like, man, suffering, I get that. That is my thing. To those in the room, I would challenge you to hear Romans 12:15. Weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. Weep with those who weep. Not provide theological proof text of why they're weeping, but to just be with them in the middle of it. Often, in our postures as Christians, it's better to be side by side than face to face. Sometimes in face to face, we're just trying to explain all the suffering in their world. And instead, what sometimes people just need is for you to just come alongside them and just be like, this really stinks. This is terrible. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't. And sometimes that's all people need to hear in the midst of suffering is just like, I'm sorry this is happening to you. I'm sitting beside you in the ash heap until we figure this out. right? You know when Job's friends were most helpful was when they were actually sitting in the ashes and not when they were trying to give him theological advice. So sometimes we just need people alongside of us in our suffering to say, yeah, I'm with you. Maybe the other side of the room, maybe this is you this morning, a heart that is not just, maybe it's not suffering for you. Maybe it's a heart that is satisfied in the superiority of Jesus. Do you actually believe what you say you believe? A heart that is satisfied in the superiority of Jesus is a heart at rest in his message. If he's truly above all things, you can face every single Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and say, you know what? My job isn't the end-all be-all. That person's gossip about me behind my back isn't the end-all be-all. The fact that I didn't make the team is not the end-all be-all. The fact that that guy got promoted above me is not the end-all be-all. The fact that somebody got away with something that I wish they wouldn't have got away with is not the end-all be-all. Because the end of it all is that Jesus is superior, better, worth more than we could ever ask or imagine. And a heart that is satisfied in Jesus, satisfied, not just I know he is, but satisfied is a heart at rest in his message. And this morning, we want to allow you time to process these things, right? It's one thing to put these on a screen and say, yeah, suffering is good in the company with Jesus. It's another thing to live it. It's one thing to say, yeah, I believe in the superiority of Jesus and my heart should be at rest. Be at rest. It's another to actually experience it, to know it. So I'm going to bring the worship team up as we're going to close. And I want you just to have this time to just be able to say, God, this is me. Just be transparent and be honest and say, do I truly believe and live as if Jesus is superior to all things in my life? Maybe this fall is like a spot for you to rededicate. Is a time for you to say, you know what? I love Christ. I've been in him for a while, but it's been a while since we've actually talked and I've actually prioritized it. Maybe this is fall for you is that new rhythms we talked about, where it's like, I want to know him fully. I want to know that he is better than everything. Or maybe this morning, this is you and you've come in with more of a heavy heart and it's been a rough summer heading into fall and you're like, I don't really know, but suffering's been a big deal and I just need somebody to pray with. We're here for you for that way as well. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask you guys to stand as we close and we're going to sing out together. And as we do so, you guys can feel free, if you need prayer, to come forward. We have some people that would love to do that. If you want to come forward and say, you know what, I just want to get this line drawn in the sand as we head into fall. Christ is superior, better than all things, and I'm going to set it that way. We'd love to have that conversation as well. Regardless, we want this to be a time for you to have with him as we think about God being our superior to all things in front of us.